Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to focus on exercise 35 and learn about branches and functions. And as always, you can find the link to the current exercise in the description below. Since this is part of the paid section of the book, you would actually have to purchase the book to follow along, or alternatively, of course, feel free to just follow along with the video. So let's get started with branches and functions by creating a new Python script. We can open our terminal and then create a new file. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, which I installed, and therefore I'm going to type in code followed by the name of the exercise, which of course ends in PI for Python. So this is going to open a new Python file, and from here we get started by actually importing exit from the sys library. We're going to continue to define a function here, and we're going to print out this room is full of gold. How much do you take? And then we're going to store the input that the user provides in our choice variable here. So if a value of 0 or 1 has been entered, which of course is stored in the choice variable, then what we're going to do is we're going to turn choice, so the value, which is 0 or 1, into an integer and store it in the variable how much. Otherwise, we're going to call a new function called dat, and pass in a string here. And we're going to define that function later on. If how much is less than 50, we're going to print out a message. And then exit with the exit code 0. Otherwise, else, we're going to call dat again and pass another string to it. Alright, so that's the first function, and next we're going to define another function, bear room. And here we have a couple of different print statements. So there's a bear here. It's a bunch of honey. The fat bear is in front of another door. And then how are you going to move the bear? Finally, we're going to set bear moved to false, so to a Boolean value. And while true, again, we're going to call input to get some user input and store that input in choice. So let's check if choice is equal to take honey. Gonna call dat again. And that's basically the input that we reflected last time when we were writing our game. But now we have it in a better structure because we are actually using different functions to define different aspects. So elif choice don't bear, then and near bear moved, if that's true, then let's print out the bear has moved from the door. You can go through it now. And now we're going to go ahead and change bear moved to true. And elif choice is open door. Oh, excuse me. Elif choice is taunt bear and bear moved. So before we checked if bear moved is false, now we're checking if that's true, and of course if the other choice is also true. Then we're going to call dead again and pass another string to it. So elif choice is open door and bear moved. Then we're going to call a new function gold room, and finally else, if none of these functions or the conditions is true, then we print out I got no idea what that means. Alright, so that's our next function here, and then we have another function, Cthulhu room. So we're going to print out, here you see the great evil Cthulhu. And again, we provide a choice here, and the user can enter some input, and depending on the input provided, we're going to perform a couple of different actions. So if flee has been chosen, then we're going to call start. elif head is part of the answer in choice. We're going to call dead, and of course pass in a string. And finally, if neither of those actions is true, then we're gonna call Cthulhu room again. So basically the function itself. So we're gonna jump back in here. Next, finally, we need to define our dead function that we've been using before. And we provide an argument here called y. So that's typically the string that we enter. And then of course finally we also want to exit. Then we have another function start. And here we're gonna print out basically the beginning of our game, that we are in a dark room. And of course by structuring it this way, we don't have to type it over and over again, but we can simply call our functions, and if we want to make a change, we can just change that in one place, basically here in our function, and then it can be used anywhere. And again, we're gonna ask for user input, and depending on the answer, we're gonna perform different actions. So here we're calling the bear room, which we defined before. Alright, and we need to make sure that there's no typo in here. So that's our start function, and then at the very end, what we're going to say is we're going to actually call our start function here, so that we can actually start our game. Alright, let's save this, and let's open our terminal again, and let's execute the code by typing in Python 3 followed by the name. And of course, here at the very end, we're going to call the start function, and that is going to start the game. So what happens here is when we call start, we have those first three print statements which are printed out here, and we have our first choice, and we can choose left or right to basically get started. So let's type in left. So now we get the input. There's a bear here. So what happens here, if we type in left, then we have bear room, which is a function up here that gets called. And so we have those print statements here on top, and then we have another input choice here, and we can provide a value. So there's a bear in here, and what are we going to do? So let's say toned bear. And now we can perform another action. For example, open door. And then we can see we take 1,000 units here. You agree the bastard, good job. So actually we made it through here. And what is displayed here, of course, depends on which function is getting called. And for each choice that we have here in our if-else statements, depending on what we enter, we will have different functions that are being executed, and we might either die, or we may, for example, go to the gold room and then get some coins. So it's basically a different way to structure the same code that we used in some of the previous exercises to make our game, but now we have split it up a little bit clearer, a little bit better, using different functions. So let's take a look at the study drill section. The first part, we basically already took a look at how our code is structured. Here at the very bottom, we have the start function, which is defined here. And based on the choice that we enter, we then execute different functions. So for example, before we entered left, and then we executed bear room, which is a function up here. So this would be the next function that is being run with the different print statements, and again with a choice. If instead we typed in right, then we would call the other function here, the other room. And again, here we have the option to enter some input, and then based on that, perform some action. So for example, if we typed in flee, we would call the start function again and basically start from the beginning. If we typed in head instead, then we would call the dead function. So here we would print out that we actually died and the reason why. And of course, we would also exit the program. And otherwise, we would just loop back to the room itself. So the same code would be executed. And again, we have the choice here. So based on that, we have a nice structure, and we can navigate through the code and through the different functions. So the next study drill is to fix all of the mistakes, including spelling mistakes. So far that looks good. I hope there are no typos in there, but the code itself could be executed, so we should be fine here. And then we can add a comment to the different functions that we do not understand. So if we take a look here at the very bottom, what we do here is we execute the start function, which is basically the beginning of our code. The start function is up here. So from here we can then say we will print out instructions, and then get user choice. And then based on that, of course, we switch to different functions here. For example, to the bear room or to the Cthulhu room. If you take a look at the bear room, for example, here we would say we execute the bear room code and ask for user choice. And based on that, of course, we would then, depending on which input is provided, execute those different functions. For example, the dead function, if somebody died, if the user died, or we can switch over to the gold room. And the same would basically happen if instead here in the start function we typed in the choice right, then we would hop over to the Cthulhu room, and here we would execute the Cthulhu room function, and again the user has a choice what he or she wants to do, and based on that other functions would be executed. So that's basically our structure. This is how our functions work together. So we could add other functions to if we wanted to, of course, but if we take a look at the final study drill, there's a question here, the gold room. Let's just jump to that one. That is here at the top. It has a weird way of getting you to type a number. What are all the bugs in this way of doing it? Can you make it better than what we've written here? Look at how int works for clues. So what we do here is we ask for some input. And maybe let's just navigate to the gold room. So let's see where it's actually being used. So we can get to it by first going to the bare room and then selecting open door. So let's do that. Let's execute the code. We can go to the left to the bare room, and now in here we can type in open door. Let's take a look at that before. Oh, so bare moved has to be correct. So we need to taunt the bear first of all. All right, and then we can type in open door since that's now true. And now we're basically in the gold room function here. So which is up here. Now we can enter an input, and here we're not directly comparing the input. But we're basically asking the user to input any number. So we can enter a value of 0, for example, or 1. And that would be then converted into an integer and stored in this variable how much. So if we entered a different number, then we would run the code here. So for example, here you really bastard, because how much is actually not less than 50. And so if we have those values in here, then it would be stored or converted to an integer and then stored, and then we can do some computation and actually compare it. So that's basically how that works. So let's finally take a look at some common student questions. The first one is help, how does this program work? So when we get stuck understanding a piece of code, then we should simply write an English comment above every line in our code so that we actually figure out what our code does and we properly understand it. Why did we write while true? So we wrote this, for example, here, and that creates an infinite loop. That means this while loop will loop over and over and over again, basically for an infinite number of times, until of course we have some condition that makes it not true anymore. So that basically means that, for example, if we end up here in this elif branch with a gold room, then of course we would switch over to another function, basically break out of our while statement. But otherwise, if there's nothing that would break us out of this while loop, then we would loop over and over again, and that can be helpful if we want to, based on which answer a user gives, simply ask over and over again. What does exit 0 do? So for example, if we take a look at our code again, we have that, for example, here in the det function, we exit with the code 0. So on many operating systems, a program can abort with exit 0, and the number passed in will indicate an error or not. So if we do exit 1, then it will be an error, but exit 0 will be a good exit. So it exits without an error, basically. So the reason it's backwards from normal Boolean logic, with 0 being false, is that you can use different numbers to indicate different error results. You can do exit 100 for different error results than exit 2 or exit 1. So if we added a number in here, for example 1, that would indicate that there's actually an error in here. Since in this case, that's just a regular way of ending the program, we can provide the value of 0, exit 0, and then we know, okay, the program has been terminated, but it's not actually an error. It's just like the regular end of the program. Why is input sometimes written as input and then in parentheses here with some input? So with some string and within that some characters. The parameter to input is a string that should print as a prompt before getting the user's input. So that's basically what happens here in front of the choices. We print out what is entered in the input function, and of course we could change that to a different character, but that's basically how that works. Alright, so that's it with exercise 35, and see you guys in the next video with exercise 36.